Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest Never More Needed webinar on the thorny issue of charity mergers. My name is Susan Smith, and I'm Campaigns Manager at SCVO. Before I introduce our topic and speakers, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So just to let you know, all webinar participants' lines are muted throughout the webinar, but you are free to chat using the chat function and to engage with each other. You can ask live questions of the panel using the Q&A function on your screen. Please do upvote any questions that you would like to see answered. And there will be a couple of polls running during the webinar. I'll let you know when these go live, and please vote immediately. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube afterwards. So please do share with your colleagues if you find it interesting. So in preparation for this event, I was reading the Institute of Voluntary Action Research document on merger during COVID-19, and one of my colleagues will post a link to that for you just now. And one of the things that highlighted was that following the financial crash in 2008, the charities that were more likely to survive were the ones that questioned themselves. They were prepared to ask themselves some tough questions about why they exist and what they wanted to achieve. Now, not to belittle the 2008 crash and the impact of recession and austerity on society, but I think that what we've been through over the last year has been so much more all-consuming. So while some charities are definitely taking the time to question their purpose and direction, others have simply been too busy getting on with the day job. However, the likelihood is that in 2021 and 22, we're going to see Scottish third sector organisations in more demand than ever, with probably less money. Government and funders don't have unlimited cash, and we have yet to see how much the public will step up through volunteering and donations. So today we're just offering an opportunity to start thinking a bit differently about different approaches that your organisation can take, such as merger. I'm joined today by two chief executives who have been through this process in the last few years and have a wealth of third sector experience to talk more generally around the issue. Lorraine McGrath has been Chief Executive of homeless charity the Simon Community Scotland since 2012 and is a former chair and existing trustee of the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland. In 2019, Simon Community Scotland merged with Edinburgh homeless charity Streetworks, and together they went on to win Scottish Charity of the Year 2020. And have been instrumental in getting homeless people off the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow during COVID-19. Pauline Gordon is Director of Social Enterprise Network Scotland, SENScot, and since it merged with Social Firms Scotland in July 2020. Before that, she was Chief Executive of Social Firms Scotland since 2008. She's going to tell us about the challenges of managing the merger of two well-established organisations during COVID-19. And she also has a wealth of experience in supporting other third sector organisations going through merger, perhaps as a result of external pressures, as well as their own desire for change. So I'm now going to open up to our speakers, and we will start off with Lorraine McGrath, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview of the Simon Community Scotland process.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Susan. I'm delighted to be joining you today. First of all, just a little tiny bit about Simon Community Scotland. We are wholly focused on combating the causes and effects of homelessness. We've been doing that for 55 years. We work with about 6,000 people a year across central Scotland largely, but we do have a number of national programmes, and we do that through street outreach, complex needs, assertive outreach, and a range of accommodation and support options across the areas that we work in. What I'm going to talk to you about is our coming together with Streetwork, which I suppose you would badge as a merger. It was an interesting journey around about early 2017. The then chair and acting chief exec of Streetwork approached us to discuss partnership. They had had an unstable period of probably 3 or 4 years where they'd had a lot of changes in their governance structure and a lot of changes in their leadership, their strategic leadership. And they were there at that point facing a massive challenge. 90% of their turnover and provision was dependent on one single contract with City of Edinburgh Council, and that contract was up for re-tender. And all the bumpy period that they'd been experiencing was heightening the risk of losing that tender. For us at Simon Community Scotland, we fully recognise, and still do, the value of local organisations like Streetwork, who punch way above their weight. And whilst 90% of their delivery and their turnover was tied up in that one contract, the other 10% that they brought in added so much value and so much impact for the people that they supported, primarily on the streets of Edinburgh, and then through Homelessness Crisis, that in living out our mission as an organisation that's focused on combating the causes and effects of homelessness, it really felt right to support them. So they were looking for formal partnership at that point. We concluded that actually the best thing to do was just to help them in the tender. And then they would be in a different position to consider what the future looked like thereafter, because at that point they were in a high-risk situation, and making decisions on the long-term nature of in that high-risk situation probably didn't make a lot of sense, and actually their future would look very different if they didn't win the tender. So we offered our expertise and our support with no strings attached at all. That quickly translated into the need for leadership into that tender process, and we were asked to consider joint strategic leadership of the two organisations, and we entered into a shared services agreement that made me joint chief exec of the two organisations, and our director of services joint director of services as well, so that we could really bring all of the expertise to bear in preparing for the tender process. Long story short, thereafter, we did manage to successfully win the tender, which didn't just secure the existing business, but actually increased the service provision. And in preparing for that and building towards that, we identified a number of other key service developments that, in using the expertise of the two organisations together, were able to increase the reach and impact that we were able to make happen for the people in Edinburgh that were affected by homelessness. And thereafter, we built and grew an awful lot of impact, bringing the expertise of the organisation together, and for the first time, the two cities and all of the aspects of the two cities, to the point where it became a bit of a no-brainer that to then disentangle that work was not in the interests of the people that either organisation supported, and in fact it was much more in the interests of the people we supported that we find a way to formalise that relationship and get the absolute maximum value out of what we were able to do together that we were not able to do apart. And that was the key driver at that point. I was clear with both boards at that point. I didn't really care what the organisational construct was. I didn't really care too much about what it said on paper, so long as it didn't get in the way of delivery, that we'd achieved a lot in maximising greater delivery impact, and that whatever we then entered into from a legal construct point of view needed to support that and needed to give life and more power to that, and not in any way take away from it. And I think that was probably one of the big challenges, was getting that right, and getting to the place where we kept the focus entirely on what we could do better together, and making sure that that delivery was empowered and not in any way disempowered by the legal processes that we had to go through behind the scenes. And loads of detail there under, and I've skimmed over the whole joint chief exec thing. Anybody wants to know more about that, I will bore them in tears on another day. Would I ever do that again? I don't know. It would depend.
Thanks, Lorraine. I'm going to come back to that very point, but before I do, I'll just go over to Pauline so that she can give us a little bit of an overview of how Social Firms Scotland and SendScot came together last year and the sort of opportunities and challenges that presented.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Lorraine. That was very interesting, chimes with some of my experience. I think what you said reminds me to say at the outset when we're talking about mergers or partnerships is everything you do as a charitable organisation must first and foremost start from, are you doing this in the best interests of the people or organisations that you support? So you never lose sight of that. This isn't about single organisational vision. It's about your beneficiaries, who you're there to support. So I'm Pauline Gordon, as Susan said, now Director of Senscott, the new Senscott, formed through the merger of Social Firms Scotland and the old Senscott, which was actually an organisation that supported social entrepreneurs. We completed our merger on the 1st of July 2020, which that was already set in train, but I didn't expect COVID to arrive, and then we had to do the legal end of the merger under lockdown conditions. However, I was previously Chief Exec, as Susan said, of Social Firms Scotland for 12 years, although Social Firms Scotland had been on the landscape for about 20 years. And our focus was very much around social firms or work integration social enterprises. In the past 5 years, we had facilitated an employability social enterprise network, which had a wider membership than social firms. And that was quite a useful catalyst in terms of our thinking around how we might work or partnership with Senscott going forward. As Susan said, I guess I was a wee bit lucky to add a bit of background to acquisitions and mergers through a lottery funded programme that Social Firms Scotland were involved in over a 3-year period. Very much about education to the third sector on the potential benefits of mergers, the potential pitfalls of mergers, and part of that was looking at acquisition of private businesses to set up more social firms, therefore employ more people who had barriers to work. I'll answer any questions on that if people want later, but I'll focus just now on the merger experience. So we were merging or potentially merging with Senscott, who already had, similar to us, a 20-year journey of supporting social enterprise in Scotland. And their structure was very much around social entrepreneurs and supporting thematic social enterprise networks. So bringing together social enterprises in the field of health, sport, culture, community, food, tourism and rural. So our boards actually made the decision to consider a merger pre-COVID. So probably 18 months or so, the timeline around the thought process, the decision making and actually implementing it. And the reason we did that was, I guess we had looked at our respective mission, vision and operational priorities and thought, actually the social enterprise sector, since both charities were established, has evolved, and therefore the national and infrastructure around support and social enterprise should also be self-reflective and evolve. We had also over the past 10 years built a very close working relationship between the two organisations. We had developed some joint initiatives. We were partners in a separate legal entity called Ready for Business, LLP, along with Community Enterprise in Scotland. We'd done more joint policy work. We had joint conference for the sector, and we had both been leading on the visioning exercise that informed the first social enterprise 10-year strategy. So our staff and leadership had worked quite well together. So why merge? The starting point was, is this good for our members, our respective members and the wider sector? And the answer to that was probably yes. We felt we were aligned in values and broadly aligned in membership. And we had already set a timeline for the merger for the 1st of July 2020. Didn't know COVID was going to arrive, so that was going to present its own challenges. And we decided that date because we were both funded partly through the Scottish Government in terms of core funding, and we only had confirmation to the end of June 2020. So we felt that was a timely point in which to merge, and then the new entity would take any proposals with the government forward at that point. So the key considerations when I'm thinking back on it is the merger in the best interests of our charity and its members. Yes. Would it streamline and improve the service portfolio? Would it have cost efficiencies in time? Would it increase income generation and make the best use of the expertise across the two organisations and the intellectual property by coming together? Yes. Were the charities compatible in terms of objects, culture, values, governance, funding base? Probably yes. We had to consider and very carefully consider the risks versus the benefits of the merger, a formal merger. And we also spent a bit of time thinking, are there other forms of collaborative working that we could explore that would achieve the same outcome, but not be a formal legal merger? And we came back to, no, we probably go down the merger route. We had to consider the costs of merging. It's very expensive in terms of staff time, in terms of any rebranding exercise, in terms of getting professional advice for due diligence. Do we have to look at premises and relocation? And there's always unanticipated costs. And so you always have to build that into your risk register. We established a merger committee to oversee the process. So it was myself and the chief executive at Senscott and our respective chairs. We started the planning process, setting milestones, timelines to keep us on track. And then we worked towards a heads of agreement, which both parties signed. We then commissioned due diligence, and I'll come back to that. Some forward planning, putting in place our EGMs, because we had to liaise with Oscar, get Oscar's approval, and consider the detail of our respective governing documents in respect of getting our members' approval and Oscar approval. We then established what we called a shadow board to oversee the whole process, and that was decided that we would bring 4 trustees from each charity to create the shadow board going forward. And that was a really good thing to do, because in the interim I was appointed as the interim director of the new entity that wasn't yet established. So I at least had a shadow board that I could go to for some guidance and support. We commissioned the legal and financial due diligence, which does require professional advice, but it is very costly. I have to be very frank with you. So it basically cost us about 35,000 to be told there's no impediment to your merger. Nonetheless, that's important for your members, for your funders, and for Oscar to make sure that you have been through a proper due diligence process. A couple of things in terms of top tips. Don't underestimate what the due diligence might throw up. There are some surprises in there that you need to deal with. In our case, there was some differentials in terms of terms and conditions, for example, salaries, pension arrangements that we had to consider and align going forward. We had to think about the best legal structure. So clearly in a merger, you have to think, do we create a new legal entity? And in our case, we ultimately decided, and quite emotional for me actually, having been Chief Executive of Social Firms Scotland for 12 years, that the most cost-effective and efficient way was to dissolve Social Firms Scotland and to pay our staff and assets into Senscott, because that was a bigger organisation. And then just consider changing the articles of Senscott, new branding, membership and governance arrangements. We had to think about the funding base of both charities, so who had restricted income, unrestricted, who had any contract income, and what were the assets and liabilities of both organisations. Was anybody carrying debt? And of course the pension, was there any pension liabilities? We had to also consider our vision and mission as a new entity, strategy and operational priorities, and any future plans that the respective charities had coming into the merger. Senscott also had a wholly owned subsidiary, so we had to consider that. And the point, I don't know if Lorraine will agree with me, there's also the point of goodwill, which is considered to be an intangible asset, but I think it's incredibly important. In relation to the values match, which is equally important, goodwill transfers as an intangible asset. And that's things like positive or negative branding or reputation in the marketplace that you operate in, or the landscape you operate in. And also, do you have any patents or technology that's owned by the organisation? And also, do you have a stable workplace and good stakeholder or membership relationships? So these things are actually quite important. So our merger, as I say, I completed it during lockdown. I did all the liaison with the lawyers and all of that. And that was relatively smooth. And it was relatively smooth because we had already built up very good working relationships with Senscott. So we kind of understood one another, we could be frank with one another, and we could fix things quickly if we needed to overcome any challenges. So we did complete, the transfer agreement was signed on the 1st of July as we had agreed. And of course that was during lockdown conditions. But as I say, it was relatively smooth. And we had, as far as practically possible, prepared and planned pre-merger. So that was really important as well. But nonetheless, you're bringing two organisations, two cultures, staff, teams together, and that needs a bedding in period that's quite difficult during lockdown. Since then, the staff team have connected really well, I have to say. They've got a new, they've got a whole host of staff that knew me from social firms, but, I've got a different leadership style from what they're used to. So there's always a way of taking your time to make sure that there's a bedding in process around that. The difficulty for me is I haven't actually been able to have all the staff in the new entity in the one room together, nor the board. So everything has been done as everybody else does digitally. However, as I say, the staff have been incredibly patient and cooperative. And in fact, the opportunities to connect and communicate over online has been incredibly important for us. And we have very regular team meetings. My staff who were trooped in along with myself have bedded in very well. We also have to bring the new members together, so we now have a new membership structure. And I think, again, during lockdown conditions, greater connection and reach right across Scotland in terms of our engagement with our respective members that have come into the new entity, and that's been incredibly important for me. So we have a wider reach than we would have if we were organising events and seminars physically. So all in all, I would say I didn't expect to be doing a merger during lockdown, but those building blocks that we had between the two organisations and quite strong foundations in our ways of working has helped incredibly in the outcome and smooth transition to the new entity. I think we'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Wow, that it was thorough and terrifying, to be quite honest. There's so much to think about. So I'm going to encourage people to put some questions into the Q&A, because even if you submitted a question in advance, I have got those. But if you really want it answered, then put it into the Q&A, and I'll make sure that it does get answered. And other people can upvote it. But before we continue with the conversation, we're just going to have our first poll, which will just get a little bit of a temperature, of what people feel about mergers. So what do you think when you hear people talk about voluntary sector, third sector mergers? Are you frustrated, terrified, neutral, or enthusiastic? your voting is anonymous, so don't worry. We won't know if you're feeling negative about it, or we won't know which of you are so enthusiastic you're desperate to give it a go. So please do vote, everyone. And we've now had most people, and I think, are we sharing the poll results now? I think we're sharing the poll results now, which show that it's pretty even. Nobody's frustrated by the idea, which is really, really good. But yeah, about a third are terrified, slightly more than a third are neutral, and a third are enthusiastic. So that's really good to hear. Listening to you both and having done a bit of reading on this, it is pretty clear that merging is not an easy answer necessarily, and that there's an awful lot of work and involved. Was it worth it, Lorraine?
Absolutely. Without a doubt, it was a huge amount of work. It was a huge and steep learning curve, and at times it was terrifying. There is no doubt about that. But what's not like that in the voluntary sector is the other side of it. In terms of what we exist to do, as the two charities as was, and as the two elements of Simon Community as is, in terms of what we've been able to do together that we couldn't do separately, it's been absolutely worth it. And that's why it very much, if you asked me to do it again, I would gulp, but totally. And the journey that we went on in terms of recognising the value of that local organisation and the identity and all of that goodwill that Pauline referenced, you can't buy that, and to lose it completely in a process of being swallowed up because of a retender or swallowed up by another organisation would have been much more harmful to the people we support than what we've done. And yes, I know that we had a shared services agreement that talked about 20% of my time and 20% of the director's time. It was never anything like that. It was like having two full-time jobs. But would I do it again? Yes. It was absolutely worth it.
And has that smoothed out now that it's
the large part of running two completely separate organisations was the structural stuff and the procedural stuff. So once the two became one and we got through that process, then yes, absolutely. You've got shared leadership, and we've been able to grow and develop a whole range of activities and resources and reach and impact in particular by bringing the organisational resources together. And more so in the first 2 years when it was the shared services agreement of bringing Simon Community resources to bear on behalf of street work, to give them resources that they didn't have availability of, like IT and HR and all sorts of stuff that was provided on a goodwill support, big brother to little sister kind of approach. And we were happy to do that because we could see the value to the people being supported and the impact in terms of outcomes for people resolving homelessness and avoiding crisis. So it was a worthwhile investment. Were we private entities, we probably would never have done things like that. We would have been cross-charging and thinking about the material impact of all of that. But because we were focused entirely on charitable purpose and the value to the people we support, which Pauline referenced as well, that allowed us to do that in a completely different way and gave me much more remit to act in those interests rather than constantly thinking about how much is this costing and what's in it for us. And I think it can be the barrier to an awful lot of those kinds of conversations. And it has been good for Simon Community as well. I mean, it has been good for us collectively as a combined entity now.
And Pauline, what about you? Do you think it was worth it? I mean, everything you've just said, like I said, sounds so daunting. Was it worth it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Sorry if I made it sound daunting. It's once you know the process, you kind of ask yourself questions throughout, and the planning around the stages, having a timeline and milestones, and trying to stick to them. It's not always possible, but it was worth it. And as I say, having the two boards being very committed to the benefits of merging in the first place meant that, you know, we already had the key drivers in place to enable it to go forward. And had the due diligence thrown up anything that perhaps once they looked under the bonnet of both organisations and there was any risks or, you know, strong risky liabilities in each end, then we might have been a wee bit more cautious about moving forward. But that didn't really happen. As I say, you know, there are always going to be a bit of difference in terms of terms and conditions and all that, but that's manageable. That's absolutely manageable. You need to keep your focus, as I said and Lorraine said, on why are you doing this, and it's for the benefits of the people you support. So there's great added value in that, bringing people together who have a lot of experience and passion about why they do their work. And that, for me, that's why it was, I said, relatively smooth. It actually was relatively smooth, because the people that sit behind both organisations are incredibly experienced and incredibly passionate about what they do. And therefore they were incredibly patient with me in going through the logistics and practicalities of the process.
So we've had a couple of questions from the audience. Brian Jenkins has asked, you mentioned due diligence cost £35,000, Pauline. Can you elaborate on why it was so high?
I wish I knew why it was so high. So we had to commission the legal due diligence end first to come in and look at the draft heads of agreement that we'd put in place. Both organisations had in principle signed up to, and they gave us some early legal advice, and then more comprehensive legal advice on looking at both articles of both charities and the staffing arrangements and all manner of things. And then they gave us an initial cost for phase 1, as they called it. And then phase 2 was another, so the first was maybe 10,000, and then the next bill was 15,000, and then we had to get the legal due diligence, the financial due diligence, which was through a partner accountancy firm of the legal end. So that was very costly as well. But both boards felt it was incredibly important that we had the professional expertise to give comfort both to our members when we went to consult our members on the merger, and secondly to Oscar and our funders. So it was important, but it was very costly, and we had to pay for that out of our reserve position, really.
Okay. And Lorraine, did you find the same thing? Did you face the same stuff?
So we faced the same challenges, but I think it is a how long is a piece of string measure of the average cost of merger, because it really depends what you've got available to you in-house and amongst the skill base around your trustees. At the end of the day, you do need the legal sign-off and the legal confirmation of where you're going. We used we got a project manager in to help us with the due diligence process and document manage and make sure everything was the detail was all pinned down, because basically closing down one charity and merging it into another there's quite a lot of process involved in that, and you're not in control of all the timings as well. So like Companies House are ruled to put a law unto themselves, and you have to be very aware of that, because once they drop the door on the charity and close it as a company, then all bets are off after that. So we can't do anything. So our costs weren't as high as that, but we had availability of expertise in-house and across the two boards that minimised the costs. So it was only when we really got to the very final stage that we had to involve the legal teams. So it was minimised, and we were able to brief very closely on that.
But you did employ a project manager?
We did employ a project, well,
yeah.
It was a consultant that we used
yeah.
a lot, and that was very low cost, so you know, that probably didn't amount to more than about £3,000, and they managed the whole process for us. But I think I was helped by the fact that I had been managing the organisation, leading the organisation in terms of street work for 2 years at that point. So in terms of being under the skin of the organisation from a due diligence point of view, we already had, you know, we knew where all the dusty corners were and where all the challenges were that we needed to unpick. But I would reflect in terms of Pauline said that don't underestimate that you might come across things in the due diligence process for either charity that in some cases were historical and they were news to the charity and the trustees at the time, because it had just been something that had been kind of hidden in the background and wasn't live and present. So when you uncovered that, you thought, all right, we need to deal with that now, like a subsidiary organisation that needed a social enterprise actually that needed closed down in the process as well. So yes, there are potential significant costs, and that has to be factored in. And I would that's one of the things that I think funders can be much more cognizant of. I think if they want to drive this agenda in the sector, in the interests of good. And I think one of the challenges for that is that so many of these situations come about because somebody's in trouble and facing financial crisis. So that makes that even more challenging. And
yeah,
big challenges for us in the sector. And I think financial crisis is the wrong reason to merge, but it does come around like that sometimes.
Well, to be honest, right now during COVID, there's going to be organisations out there facing financial crisis or feeling that they're using up their reserves and being very unsure about the future. You know, this event is sort of suggesting that that's not a bad reason to come together.
It isn't a bad reason.
As I said in the intros, sorry, just, you know, when you're up against it and you're just trying to stay afloat, it's really difficult to have this space to consider that properly. Yeah,
it is, and it's that kind of that knee-jerk, I suppose, can be a bit of a concern. And you know, controversially, none of us exist to exist. We exist to deliver services, so it's not always a case of always having to perpetuate that there is a future for that organisation, either standalone or through merger. And I think that's one of the traps we all fall into, is that we can't envisage a future without our existence. And that's a tricky thing, and maybe those tough decisions need to be part of the considerations of, is it the right time for us to exit this space and let somebody else come into it that does have the financial stability and sustainability available to them, rather than spending a lot of money merging with another organisation and a lot of energy, and the net impact for the people supported is the same.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lorraine. Pauline, I'm going to pick up a wee bit then on your experience of supporting other organisations in this. I think you said that you've been there when organisations have been getting pressure through contracts or funding to merge with other organisations. Can you maybe just tell us a wee bit about that?
Yeah. So some of the mergers that we supported, or acquisitions that we supported through the lottery programme, they were third sector specific. were almost forced mergers because perhaps they all had SLAs, and then the council decided this advocacy service or whatever was going to be wrapped up into one big contract, and therefore there was a more, I guess it felt more forced than genuinely about self-reflection and your mission and your place in the landscape and your beneficiaries. So that's more challenging, and it requires more mediation, I think, is a good word to use from my experience of some of that. You know, having people in a room who are first and foremost thinking about how am I going to pay the salaries in the next quarter, is this the right thing to do? So for me, you can come through that well with more mediation, but you actually have to fundamentally say, are we adding value by coming together? And do we become then more than the sum of our parts? And for me, that if the answer to that is yes, and the motivations are right, then you can go through that process and come out the other end all the better for it. I think for too many years, the mergers, particularly in our sector, has been seen as a bit of a dirty word, and that the catalyst for it is always financial crisis. Sometimes it is, or that the financial dimension is important and a component of the thought process around mergers, but it shouldn't be seen as a dirty word. It's that from Lorraine's experience and my experience, it's actually a very positive experience because you're doing the right thing for the right reasons. And I think if you bear that in mind, then it's worth it, and it's certainly not, it's not for everyone. But as I said earlier, we did stop at one point and consider, we know this is the right thing to do in terms of a more formal collaboration with Senscott, but could we think of any other reasons? Should we have more formal partnership arrangement with them, or an MOU, or some other way of achieving the same outcome and benefits? And having considered that, we thought, no, actually a formal merger is the right way for us. So I hope people don't see it as a very risky thing to do, nor compelled by, we're in financial crisis, we need to merge with other organisations. And nor should funders, I think, force people to behave in a certain way as a charitable organisation, because we're all, you know, if you're a charitable organisation, then you have to think about why you exist. You exist to support your charitable objects, you exist to support people and organisations, and you're part of a wider landscape. And I think at times I would hope funders wouldn't do that, but I certainly think we can all have an honest conversation, a wee bit more adult conversation about the benefits of mergers, formal partnerships and collaborations.
So picking up on that point about funders that both of you have just mentioned, we've got a couple of funders in the audience, and one of the pre-submitted questions was how funders can best support organisations through this, can usefully contribute to this agenda rather than sort of feeling like they're forcing it.
So for me, it is about, you know, it's a huge consideration and a resource drain to even go through the consideration process. So having specific available funds or proactively offering that out to organisations that are potentially in that space to support just the initial considerations to facilitate that, and also encouraging the development of that, you know, really skilled facilitation. You know, the word merger is a big catch-all for a lot of different types of arrangements that could be put in place, and we are very fortunate in the voluntary sector that we could have a lot of different arrangements that wouldn't be available to us in the private sector, for instance. So having skilled expertise and facilitating the growth of that to support the sector. But I think the biggest thing was probably the cost of even just putting energy into having the first conversations with other organisations, and funders can specifically facilitate that. And to be live to the realities that they are seeing, because they're absorbing a lot of the data and information about organisations and their performance and where they're at in the sector, and they will have sight of two organisations doing similar work who may be struggling a little bit, or who may be, you know, doing similar work, and if they came together or they worked together, so they can facilitate conversations as well and make suggestions. They should never force it. I think that's absolutely so. No, so, and whether that's a grant funder or a local authority or a national funder, it should never be the charitable purpose of an organisation and its vision, mission, and articles should never be dictated to by anybody other than either its beneficiaries or the trustees who are custodians of that at that point in time. It just shouldn't be dictated to by anybody. I think that results in more harm than good, because that would be entirely a financial driven decision by a funder rather than a charitable purpose decision, and that would be of huge concern.
I would agree wholeheartedly with what Lorraine said, but I think funders and commissioners are important stakeholders in the conversation, and the conversation can happen, should happen, because, you know, if you're in receipt of public money, then we all want to be delivering value for money, and therefore I think if COVID has taught us anything about the third sector more broadly, it's their agility, flexibility and willingness to partner and collaborate with others, because their focus, particularly during COVID, has been let's respond to what people and communities need. And for me, if there's anything really good that can come out in the post-COVID era for our sector, it's a recognition of that collaborative spirit, mutual aid groups emerging, people connecting with one another, and saying, actually, I usually deliver, I know of sports social enterprises that have very early COVID thought, oh, we can't do this. We can't open our premises. We can't do what we normally did, because their income generation ceased overnight because they couldn't bring kids in for summer camp. But what they did do, and very, very quickly, was, well, we can't do that, but what can we do? And so they completely pivoted their services, used their premises to deliver food to people in communities that needed it, and needed it quickly, and partnered with other community groups in the area, loads of volunteers and community transport organisations in terms of the logistics of delivering something that was very new to their organisation. So that collaborative spirit, I think, don't lose sight of it, and the mergers should be seen as part of a landscape of opportunity for the third sector.
Great. I want to pick up on one of the questions that's been submitted now as well by Linda Gillespie, who asks how significant the role of both chief executives is to a successful merger. I think that also picks up on that tricky point about you have two charities with two chief execs, and how does that, could you maybe tell us how you decided that with your organisations, and then what that meant in terms of workload and so on?
Okay, I'll start. So clearly you've got two chiefs, that's part of your thought process and conversations throughout the merger process. How do we deal with this issue? You may have two finance people, you may have, so it's all of those things considered along the way. And both their respective charities pre-merger clearly discussed has to be a fair process in terms of who leads that organisation. So who leads the new entity, no matter what the legal structure we end up. And I, as Chief Executive of Social Fund Scotland, I was completely up for that. I wasn't precious about my place in it. If there wasn't room for me, fair enough, but I was very passionate about being part of the new entity. But fairness in terms of process about who leads was important. It transpired that the chief executive at Sainscott wanted to step back, and he wasn't looking to come up against me, if you like, and therefore that kind of, you know, didn't transpire so much. But then there was quite a senior person in Sainscott as well, that I worked very closely with already. So it was in the interest of fairness that the board, the shadow board, decided, well, how do we look at governance and leadership and look at that early enough in the process? And I have to say, you know, the shadow board met pre-formal merger, and I obviously was at the meetings with the chief executive of the Others Charity, and then we left, and then the board had decided we need to get somebody in now as the interim. And I was very, very surprised actually that they phoned me that night to say, would you step in as the interim director, which I did. And then once the merger happened, they asked me to take up that role on a permanent basis. So I guess it could have been more difficult for me.
I think I was really lucky because the incumbent at Streetwork was interim and part-time, and actually had been brought in to do some future visioning with the board about what the future was going to look like, given all the challenges that they were facing at that time and all the uncertainty that they had just been through. I was also really fortunate that the chair was fairly new to the organisation as well, so all that, you know, asking turkeys to vote for Christmas thing was not really as present, because I think it's really challenging, because I mean, none of us want to put our futures at risk. So I think it is really challenging, and it's down to the boards to be as clear and as supportive and as open and transparent in that as they possibly can be, and for them to provide the governance and leadership to make it possible for the chief execs to have very honest conversations with them about that process. But there is no doubt that in terms of being the kind of stewards of the charitable purpose on behalf of each organisation, you are emotionally invested, you are psychologically invested, so putting all of that at risk is a big ask of chief execs, but it's all in the handling of it. I think it is all in the handling of it in terms of the journey that you take people on, and that is where the expectations of the board in terms of how they support the leadership in both organisations or multiple organisations is really critical. And I'm not sure there are many board trustees and chairs who are properly equipped for that. And again, there's maybe a skills gap in the sector around that. There's lots of people with experience in the private sector, but it's so different in the voluntary sector.
Interesting. Yeah, where do we fill that gap from? We've only got 5 minutes left to go. And I'm going to put up the final poll before we finish up. And it's, do you think your organisation is more likely to think about merging with another group after COVID-19? Once again, the answers are anonymous, so you don't have to worry about us knowing anything. I think while people are answering this question as well, I'm just going to mention that we've had another question from Brian Jenkins, which I don't think we're going to have time for, I'm afraid, Brian. But if you email it, well, I'll pass it on to Lorraine and Pauline, and make sure somebody gets back to you, because I suspect that you're keen to have a more in-depth conversation than we can have in this webinar for an hour. I think a few more of you could vote, but if not, we'll assume that's everybody. And the response was, well, the response I think was that more people said that they would be likely to consider merger after COVID-19, which I think makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to ask both speakers just to finish up by maybe offering a little bit of advice for organisations who are thinking about whether this might be a way to best support their service users in the current landscape where, as we've discussed, there's less money, there's more demand for services. Because, you know, you've both highlighted how much work is involved in this. And Lorraine in particular, you mentioned that joint chief executive thing was just was like having two jobs. And I've certainly read that about other people, chief execs who've gone through mergers, about how much staff time and effort it takes. And if you're actually looking to make things easier for your organisation and better serve your community, the idea of taking on a big, massive job that's going to take a year to complete could be quite daunting. So maybe what hints and tips would you provide, Pauline, first off?
First of all, don't be afraid of it, and don't think just merger. Think about collaboration in relation to the people or organisations that you support. So it's about adding value, it's about best value, and it's about, I mean, for a small country, our third sector, as we all know and love it, is really diverse, and that's one of its strengths. But we have a heavy infrastructure in Scotland, we have a big third sector, and therefore there's bound to be, and you know, I've reflected on this through my years, there's bound to be crossover in service offerings and support offerings, and therefore collaboration. How can I collaborate? How can I understand who's in the space that I operate in that I could buddy up with and deliver added value more than the sum of their parts? And merger should feature as part of that conversation, because it's not a dirty word. It's if you think about the outcome, focus on your beneficiaries and have that as your vision. Go on the journey. If you need to stop at any point, that's fine. But actually, I think we may well see more mergers or joint ventures or in the post-COVID era, and I think that's probably what's going to happen. But you know, don't be scared of it. And if anybody wants to come and talk to me in more detail about my experience, I'll be more than happy to do that. I do think we need to have a more conversation about it. So I applaud you for inviting Lorraine and I to come and talk about it. Thanks very much.
I totally agree, Pauline. We need more conversations about it, and it's just unfortunate that there's not another term that we can use other than merger, because it's so corporate. And my advice would be, go dating before you talk about getting married. You know, find organisations that you think, oh, we do good stuff, or we complement each other. Talk to them, find something to just points of connection, to do something with your existing resources together. Don't just do it because there's a funding opportunity to work together. Go and find something to complement each other on, and that will give you the chance to do the sense check on the sense of overlap, connectedness, the values check. Are you like-minded? What are the big barriers? If that goes well, date a little bit more, plan a holiday together, maybe, and then move towards getting engaged and married. And that can be as quick as you need it to be. But in a crisis-driven world, you're going to feel protectionist, you're going to feel at risk. Whereas if you go out reaching proactively, kind of having a chat, mergers don't need to be seen as loss. And I think it's a dirty word, because people can perceive it as somebody wins and somebody loses in a merger more often than not. And we need to not see it like that. We need to see it as an opportunity to do better and do more with what we've got, and not just think about what else we can do to get more funding and more opportunity and more sustainability. And sometimes you can best deliver your charitable purpose by recognising that somebody else can do that better than you can in the future, and handing over that baton to another organisation. Yeah. And it's a tough one, because that will feel like loss to the people that are emotionally invested in that charity. But actually, when it comes down to it, that's where the trustees of Streetwork got to, was they could clearly see that actually handing the baton over to Sound Community Scotland as a whole delivered the charitable purpose of the organisation in a much bigger and better way than they could, even though they did have the financial sustainability to continue at that point. They could have stood back from us and carried on, but they said, no, we can see now that we are as custodians of that purpose, we are doing better for the people we exist to support by taking this action than we could by standing alone.
Thank you. I think that's really good insight, Lorraine, and I think it is really important and as you said, really hard. If you care passionately, as so many charity trustees and staff as well within charities do care so passionately about the organisation that they're involved with. But ultimately, especially at a time like this, it is about keeping that end user in sight, and how can we best create the society that we all want to live in, really. Okay, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, because I had lots more questions, and clearly there's a few people in the audience who were desperate to get a little bit more. I know that Lorraine did actually share her email address in the chat for anybody who wants to speak to her, and I'll certainly pass on that one question to Pauline as well. So thank you both for taking part. Everybody else, remember this webinar has been recorded, and so you can share it with colleagues. And this was part of the Never More Needed campaign, which is a campaign that SCVO is running to promote and discuss the role of the third sector during COVID and beyond. And we are raising awareness of activities like this. You can find out more about that at scvo.org.uk/nevermoreneeded. So thank you very much, everyone, and we hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.